to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from the UK, where I teach at Westminster Theological Center. I'm a co-host of the podcast with Matt Bates, Drew Johnson, Erin Heim, and Chris Tilling. And in this episode, Matt, Drew, Erin, and I get together and have a Q&A episode. These are questions that you've sent in, and we have answered, or at least we've responded. It's more like responses than answers, but we do have some thoughts on a random thing or two, and we always enjoy getting together. So the Q&A episodes are a great opportunity for us to connect because we're all busy, and so just carving out this time is actually quite enjoyable. So thanks for helping make that happen with your questions. As always, you could send questions for future Q&A episodes. You can email them to onscriptpodcast@gmail.com or tweet them to us, and we'll try to throw them in for a future episode at some undisclosed time because we don't know when. I want to also just express my thanks again to Ed Hatkey for production. He does the audio production for the show, and if you ever hear things that are not so good in terms of audio quality, I guarantee you it's because we've sent Ed some pretty crappy files to work with, and he's made the most of them, and we appreciate him for that. And so we want to just say thank you, Ed, for all your audio production help, and to Tommy Molman as well, who's helpful with marketing. He's been super on that front. So and thank you so much to all the others of you who help in various ways with the production of this podcast and also the support of the podcast by giving monthly or one-off gifts. We really appreciate those. And finally, thanks for those of you who've given reviews on iTunes. Apparently, I hear that they help. I have no idea if they do, but it's like it's one of those things where all the other podcasts say, "Oh, hey, review us on iTunes," because it helps people find out about us. And so I'll say it, but I have no clue if it actually helps. But we appreciate. I actually like reading through them and seeing encouraging things. So if anything, because as an act of encouragement. If any of you have the gift of encouragement, please go on over to iTunes, and just for that reason, do it. And I think that's it for now, so I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to the OnScript Q&A. There's 4 of us here together. Let's get started. Who's here?
Drew, Chicago, Illinois.
Wait, Drew, why are you in Chicago?
Oh, I'm on a research fellowship here at TEDS, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School.
Cool. Who else?
Erin from Denver, Colorado.
Erin, why are you in Denver?
Well, I currently live here, at least for the meantime.
Yeah, this is Matt Bates from Quincy, Illinois.
Wow. All right. So we've got a bunch of questions to get through, and this might end up being a speed round because we ended up talking a lot before this recording started. And so I'm just going to get right to it. So from Joshua Heaven. Okay. How do you define your academic discipline and its importance?
I'm interdisciplinary, so I don't have a discipline, so I get a pass on this one.
Okay. Nice try.
I think I'm going to be also passing on this one because I'm horribly undisciplined.
But what's your academic discipline? I think that means are you in you're near NT, Erin?
I know what it means. I'm just kidding.
Got it.
No, yeah, I'm New Testament, as is the illustrious Matt Bates. My academic discipline and its importance. I think biblical studies, for me, is something that I do in terms of its importance. I guess maybe that's an easier question for me, but I think it's important because I'm committed to biblical studies serving the church. And while there are plenty of biblical scholars who see themselves more as historians, I think The further I get into my own interests in writing and research, the more I'm interested in the intersection of biblical studies and theology, and the need for biblical scholars to be at least conscious of the theological frameworks in which they're working.
I think that, the follow-up question to that does kind of move into the intersection of critical scholarship and Christian faith, acknowledging that most of us work there. And I think that's probably because it's very difficult to define our discipline apart from an acknowledgement of divine revelation as sort of a foundational starting point, which is, obviously that's both a systematic claim, a philosophical claim, a claim that impinges on biblical studies in every way, and without that as its foundation, we really have no work to do that would be distinctive. We just sort of float back into the humanities otherwise, right, as some sort of, like, seeing the Bible, some sort of just like mere cultural product. And I don't think that any of us see the Bible that way. So as we all think about our academic discipline, I mean, that's difficult because I think we have our own philosophical, theological commitments to it that aren't necessarily shared by all of our colleagues in the discipline. There would be many people in biblical studies that don't necessarily share that commitment to divine revelation. So I think as we seek to define these things, obviously we always are going to move back to philosophical and theological foundations.
But I think there's also a challenge then for people of faith, and also I think maybe for our people, agnostics in biblical studies, to figure out how we work together. And I certainly would still like to, run in the same circles and work with people who approach biblical studies from a position of non-faith while maintaining my grounding as a committed evangelical scholar, without bracketing those commitments while I'm doing biblical studies, if such a thing were even possible, which I don't necessarily think that it is.
Yeah, I think for me, this question strikes at, it may sound corny, but I like the fact that Christians, non-Christians, atheists, agnostics work in biblical studies because the one thing it forces us to do, at the end of the day, I used to chair a session in SBL with a good friend of mine who's a colleague who's an atheist. I mean, he's a pretty out-and-out atheist. I'm not calling him out on that. So when we talk about our topic, we have to discuss it in such a way that we're looking at the same object and discuss. Now, obviously, you're always bringing presuppositions, and I have some theological backloading that I might want to put behind the discussion. But at the end of the day, I need to be able to show him from the text, the material world, the cultures, the historical background, the linguistics. I need to be able to demonstrate, somewhat objectively, that what I'm seeing is actually there in the text. And having somebody that doesn't share my theological commitments, in many ways for me, acts as a kind of a double check, maybe a null hypothesis in some way, that I'm not just letting my presumptions slip in to the side, even though I think there's a rightful place for my presumptions in other contexts.
Yeah, let me go on to the next question then. Do you regard it as a good thing that biblical studies is a separate thing from Christian theology? And, I'll just start off on this. I don't think it necessarily is a separate thing from Christian theology, because it is what it is in various contexts. And so, just to take my own immediate context at WTC where I teach, it's intimately connected with Christian theology, because my closest working colleague, my boss, Lucy Pepiot, is a systematic theologian. And so we don't separate that. Now, in book catalogs from Erdman's, they're separated. In sessions at SBL, they're separated, but not always. And so, I think it. But as a sort of temporary step, I don't know if that's the right way of putting it, but sometimes it can be useful to have that field of biblical studies that operates across Jewish, Christian, agnostic, and atheist camps operating for precisely the reasons we just said. But then, as a Christian, I want to link it back to systematic or to Christian theology.
Yeah, I think it's kind of an artificial. It's like the three-part division of the law between moral, ceremony, and civil. And we say, well, it's artificial, but it's sometimes helpful to separate those out just so you can talk about them, or subjective object. I'm not sure there actually is a difference or an absolute separation between subject and object, but it's helpful to talk about them from those different perspectives. So yeah, it's it's not where we necessarily ever have to end up in our thinking, but it's helpful along the way. And I think I'm sure we would all agree. There's been lots of people who don't share our faith commitments who we've learned from profoundly. You know, they taught us things that we wouldn't have seen otherwise.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there's people rightly lament the separation of disciplines, biblical studies from systematic theology and so on. But I think when done well, can actually be very productive, because as an Old Testament scholar, immersing myself in the Old Testament, thinking, writing, researching from that angle, then I'm able to bring that to the conversation. And so I sort of am always looking at Christian theological subjects when I do that from an Old Testament vantage point. And I think that voice is important and matters in a broader discussion.
Well, and I think, too, I agree with what Matt just said in terms of all of us being able to be good stewards of our individual fields, whether it be Old Testament, New Testament, or Christian theology. But I think we all need to be a little bit better at being hospitable toward one another. If I can maybe draw on, the language of Romans, because that's what I'm studying right now. Just in terms of being open and receiving one another, because I don't think when you offer somebody hospitality, you invite them into your space where they, in essence, have to play by your rules. And I think also we need to be willing to go into other spaces. And I think there are, a different set of presuppositions for how theologians think. And I think, there's different books, there's just a whole different world. And I don't think biblical scholars are always very good at recognizing the contribution that theologians make, and I don't think that theologians are necessarily always very good at recognizing the contribution that biblical scholars make. And I think if we were all a little more hospitable and welcoming to one another into our siloed conversations, then maybe the disciplines would be more beneficial to not just each other, but to the church.
I think that's especially true. But also, I think, just sociologically, what I've noticed is that actually puts the onus on biblical scholars to be the most hospitable. Because I was at Logos last year, which is a Bible and theology playground, as it were. And there was a noticeable trend that anybody who presented something on the philosophical, theological side, the Bible scholars would just kind of go, well, that's not biblical. That's not the Bible. And I tend to do it as well. And it's kind of the trump card, because they can say, well, that's not what Anselm thought. And, the Bible scholars are like, so what? Who cares what Anselm thought? Maybe that's interesting, but it's not biblical. So there is this kind of trump card that biblical scholars tend to hold in that conversation and batter philosophers and theologians with, sometimes rightfully so, and sometimes it seems just like a power play. So I think biblical scholars actually have to put the best foot forward there and recognize that the concepts and language are going to have to be translated between, and they're going to have to play nice. Because believe it or not, even in biblical studies and theology, not everybody plays nice.
Do you have anyone in mind?
You want me to name top 5 here, or
Drew Johnson?
Yeah, I mean, how many times have you heard? I think from the biblical studies side, you often hear that idea that systematic theologians want to put everything in a box and have it all nice and neat, and so. But we biblical scholars can handle the complexity and the messiness and the contradictions and all this kind of thing. And I think that mentality comes from not actually having read systematic theology and not from a clear understanding of what systematic theologians are doing. And I mean, that's just one of many examples of the way that I've sort of gone through phases, I think, personally with this too, where when I first got into biblical studies, for whatever reason, I picked up this idea that theologians were the bad guys, and then I had to kind of unlearn that. Okay, next question. Well, here's an easy one. Can you please share with us how you've learned from failure in your academic work and or life? Matt, I think you could probably kick it off here. Just kidding.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that, word of affirmation. I was wondering if you have some specific instances in mind. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that, obviously this is a huge question. It could come, as it says, both academic work and or life. I think for me, one of the things that I've just learned over the course of my life is that it's very difficult to do things alone. I certainly still tend to be a lone ranger, and that's even sort of the nature of the beast here for me, because I'm in a very small department. There's only 2 theologians here. So I don't have the luxury of as much collaboration as I would like with other people just by virtue of my department size, which kind of sucks, to be honest. I love OnScript partly for that reason, too, is it gives me a broader opportunity to engage with other scholars, and that's fun for me. But one thing I learned certainly was that I had a very difficult time when I had to live by myself. I hated that. It was just a depressing season of my life. This was in between my, it was during my senior year of college. I lived by myself. And then my first 2 years as I was working out of college. And I was like, dude, I've got to get married. Like, this is like, I'm like lonely. I'm depressed. I'm like,
I'm just the personal.
Wait a second, I'm grabbing a screenshot of Erin
itself.
Heim's face right now.
I said the personal
What'd you
ad
say?
just writes itself. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, yeah. So, but I don't know that it was like a tremendous failure. I suppose it was just like a realization of my limitations, and just that, I think that it's even still true that after, going home and working hard, there's no greater joy than coming home to my family and having like something more interesting than, staring at a computer screen or working on a manuscript or, even teaching students. Like, there's some personal dimension to that, but it's not as rich as like, kind of the depth that you get with family life. So I don't know. That's something that was meaningful to me. So,
yeah, I was linking it to, I was thinking more in my academic work life. I didn't quite think I wanted to spill the beans on all my personal failures on OnScript, but I think one of the things that I had to really grow in was just confidence, like figuring out how to negotiate the way that my identity gets so easily tangled up with my academic work, and figuring out the right relationship between that. Because on the one hand, you could say, well, I'm going to detach myself and like this, it's not me, and I'm not defined by my work, and create a total separation. But on the other hand, like, this is a big part of what I do, and I can't deny that. And so how do I deal with failings like when I was looking for a job in academia, I remember I had a spreadsheet of all the jobs I was applying to because I had to keep track of them. And I applied to like 55 different things. It wasn't all jobs. It was, some of them were, postdocs and various other opportunities. And, I was turned down by almost every single one. And dealing with that was quite difficult because of that very reason I just said, where on the one hand, my identity isn't summed up by this work, by academia, and I don't want it to be, but on the other hand, it's a big part of what I do. And then I had to learn through failure in teaching. This goes back before that, but I remember it just made me think of the first few times I would teach. I had this thing where I would start teaching and I got so nervous I couldn't even lift my head up. And I would sort of like stare down at my notes and my head would freeze and I couldn't pry it up to look at the classroom. And so anyway, it took me a long time to get to the point where I was just comfortable in the classroom environment. And that was, it took many years actually. So yeah, those are a few of mine.
I actually have a video. So our college has done a video series with professors of their failures. So they're like really nicely, they came in and interview us, and they basically said, they'll like an email that says, would you be willing to share, like, could you think of a failure that, where students could learn from it? I'm like, I will get a short list to you. I'll get it narrowed down. And so we did these nice little videos, which is great. I told about a time when I completely tanked it and kind of messed a bunch of things up and how I had to learn from it. And so if you can watch that video on drewjohnson.com. But also the other thing I decided to do is I had my diplomas, and they were just in a box, laying loosely in a box like paper. And my wife was like, you got to protect those somehow. So I went to IKEA and got $1 frames, and I put them all in $1. And I had like my military discharge papers and my GED and all that kind of stuff. So I put them all in frames just to kind of protect them. I was like, well, I'm not going to put these frames up in my office. I thought, oh, this would be a nice little teachable moment. So I got an equal number of frames in a different color, and I printed out rejection letters. And and so if you go in my office, you'll see a wall on the bookshelf of nothing but rejection letters. And if you move those, behind them are the diplomas. But what's funny is I've never had a student, like every once in a while, a student would go like, are those emails framed? And I'm like, oh yeah, you should read them. Read them all. I got more on my computer. That's just like a sampling of the top 10, So yeah, I think integrating, I think talking about our failures with our students and with our churches and being very open and honest about them. Once you've been able to process them, I think as well, it's probably not good to always just blurt out your failures, but when you've seen how God has used it to teach you, I think it's really good for us to constantly be talking about where we messed up. I mean, Lord knows the Bible is a long litany of failures. So
I have a little different story to share. So at Denver Seminary, where I was actually a student before I was professor there, we have to write learning contracts for our training and mentoring like every semester. And as an MA student, I had to go through like 3 intensive semesters where you focus on some aspect of your life where you want to grow. And in my like previous life, I was a musician and taught music at an elementary school, but also have a degree in trumpet performance. And what you learn when you're in that world of really like competitive, cutthroat, like classical music is to be a perfectionist in every aspect of your life. Like nothing is ever good enough. You don't feel like failure is an option. And yet, you're playing music. So you're never going to, like live, it's never, I mean, at least as a student, you're never going to be perfect, right? So I carried that with me. I was a good trumpet player, and I went to the University of Minnesota. So I was comparing myself to like people, studying for their DMA. So I was this, little 18-year-old girl thinking I needed to be as good as a doctoral student. So I really pushed myself, and I got to seminary and realized that I was so afraid of failure that it was like crippling. So I wrote a learning contract on how to like cope with perfectionism. I mean, in hindsight, I probably should have also like gone into counseling, but I didn't have the wisdom to see that then. So as a way of countering, failure, in addition to, doing lots of self-care things, I decided that like as an adult who's never ever enrolled in anything like this before, I took adult ballet, and it is the single most embarrassing thing I have ever done. But it was also really fun. But at first it was so uncomfortable because every week I would go and there was all these people who just wanted, they had danced as kids and they wanted to continue dancing. And then there was me who had never put on ballet shoes in my life. I love music and I love art, but I definitely am not a ballet dancer. So I failed at every week so that I would become more comfortable just by failing. And what I learned from doing that actually it's something that stuck with me, is that, the opposite of perfectionism isn't, it's not failure. Like that, the opposite of perfectionism is creativity. Like giving yourself permission to do something that's risky and to take a leap when you're not really sure what the outcome is. And I think as I've been able to let go of my perfectionism, it makes you a better scholar and a better thinker, because all of a sudden it's not about getting it exactly right the first time. It's about trying something out and then refining it until it's good.
I'm going to quote you on that. That's really good. The Christian psychiatrist Richard Winter, he says, I think he has a book on this where he says perfectionism is the last known sin that you can perform openly in church and people will praise you for it.
Going back to part of our earlier discussion, do you think when we think about the disciplines of, Bible and in the way that they get narrowed down to, like, I'm not just a Bible scholar, I'm an Isaiah scholar. And actually, I'm a first Isaiah scholar. Do you think part of that is we stay in our safe lane because of perfectionism, fear of failure in a larger field that fosters that kind of mentality?
There was a Chronicle of Higher Ed article making this claim that that's why academic writing is so horrible, is because it's fraught with insecurity, and it's always bolstering the fences ready for an attack, basically. And so
look at the number of footnotes in older books. Yeah. I mean, you see the anxiety rising as the footnotes increase, and I'm guilty too. And I think that's like a good measure.
Yeah, he or she who hasn't had a full half page of their book with footnotes.
Yeah. All right. So let's keep moving on. Okay, for each of you. All right, let's keep this short. What is your most controversial or embarrassing scholarly opinion? One that sits most uncomfortably with the opinions of wider scholarship.
Matt, I think you've strategically skipped a question here, because you were the only one who was the target of the question. It says, the question we asked, what in biblical scholarship, what do you hope would die?
Of course.
And I went through it and I realized, well, we have all said this on the air.
Oh, I haven't?
You're the only one who has not, so.
Oh, right, because you've both been interviewed and Matt's said it. So, I was going to go with the idea, it doesn't come out of Old Testament studies, actually, but the idea that the early church suppressed the Gnostic Gospels and other literature in order to advance this kind of single, narrowly defined orthodoxy. I think that's one idea. And maybe that has died and I'm just not in tune enough, but that's one thing I think I would want to see die.
Yeah, I don't think you hear that from too many scholars today, unless they're horribly naive, but certainly it's a popular idea.
Yeah. Well, it's around. And, okay, so let's go for it. Embarrassing opinions.
Oh, okay. I'll start with that. My embarrassing scholarly opinion, and this is just perfect since our previous conversation about, needing to love systematic theology and yada, yada, yada. Right here, not a fan of Karl Barth. Not at all. It's a huge waste of time to read him. If you all want to waste your lives reading Karl Barth and his gigantic tomes, you go right ahead. But every time I read him, I tell you what, I'm having a huge snooze fest, and I get nothing out of it. Very little out of it. And I find his work to be just an enormous waste of time. There you go. Controversial, awful, and I am a bad person and a bad theologian.
I thought you were supposed to be embarrassed about this. You don't sound embarrassed. You sound like you've needed to get that off your chest for a long time.
That's my defense mechanism. Like you guys were also talking about scholarly insecurities. I know that I should be insecure about that, and so I'm trying to sort of go over the top by some machismo and appear like I just am flaunting it, but I'm really shaking in my boots.
Yeah. So, Erin, your reaction suggests that you're a big fan of Barth. Is that?
I find him fascinating. I don't know. Maybe I just don't think in linear ways, and it seems like he doesn't really either. So I actually really enjoy him. I teach a course on Romans, so I've read more Karl Barth on Romans than I have Karl Barth's systematic theology, that I've read, some of that too, or church dogmatics. But I just find him an interesting conversation partner with the text. But it's not about the text. I feel like when you read Karl Barth's commentary, it's like the text is kind of he's off in his own little world. But I think, it spurs interesting questions for me. So yeah, I like Karl Barth. And I have to say that a lot of the people I was, when I was doing my PhD, a lot of my friends were studying Karl Barth. So it kind of rubbed off a little bit, to be honest.
Yeah, you know what? They were all studying Karl Barth because studying Karl Barth is cool, not because he's good.
I don't know. No offense to my friends at Otago, but I don't think any of us can be like cool's a relative term, right? Like none of this is cool, you guys.
Yeah, I think we're pushing the envelope by calling any of us
Erin,
cool.
do you want to segue from that to your embarrassing opinion?
Oh, well, I love theology. and that's kind of embarrassing as a biblical scholar. I think it's, I would happily sit down and read theology. And maybe the second most embarrassing opinion is that I think there's actually a good case to be made that Paul wrote all of the letters attributed to him.
I'm with you. That was whenever I had to do mine. The idea that had to die was that he didn't write them all. I do think Paul wrote them all. So, yeah, I'm with you.
I think for me, one that probably within the wider field of biblical scholarship would be frowned upon is that I think there's an impulse toward unity in the biblical traditions and the Bible. And I think, in other words, that the Bible has been woven together in a way that is broadly coherent. And I think that's one that's not very popular. I think scholars make finer and finer distinctions and cases for not only diversity but kind of like warring factions behind every text, and I think that's problematic. But that's probably one for me.
This question I struggled with because I feel like every book I've ever written is wildly controversial. Like with biblical scholars, it would be controversial. With philosophers, for different reasons, it's controversial. For theologians, for different reasons, it's controversial. So I feel like I'm just a walking, embarrassing scholarly opinion machine. But last year at St. Andrews, I did write a manuscript for a book that is probably the one that is going to catch the most fire, and that's, I'm arguing, so it's not really an opinion, it's a full-fledged argument that the Hebrew Bible contains within it a full philosophical system that rivals the Greeks.
Ooh, that's exciting. When does that come out?
I'm not even looking at publishers yet. I'm having friends rip it apart. I'm trying to pick very carefully the minefield that I'm getting ready to walk through with that book. So,
which leads us to our next question. Would Paul have circumcised his son?
As the non-biblical scholar in the group, I will take this first. I will say depends on where he lived.
I would say he would have someone else do it. That's my opinion.
Nice dog.
I think Paul would have regarded it as a matter of indifference.
Now, in this question, is there a presumption that Paul's like a baby daddy? Like this could have been a woman he wasn't married to, a child he left in one of his cities, or that he's married to somebody? And
I think that's the assumption.
I would say Drew, not the Holy Spirit. That I think depending on what town he's in, when he gets his wife preggers, his hypothetical wife hypothetically pregnant, might determine.
Well, I suppose if the hypothetical wife, I suppose it also would matter, I think, to Paul if she were a Jew or a Gentile, which also he seems to, regard as a matter of indifference. I think if she were Jewish, I think he would be likely to have his son circumcised. Only because, not because Paul regards it as something that's essential, but because for the same reason I think he has Timothy circumcised, that it becomes a way of meeting people where they are, and it gives him access, to the Jewish community. Otherwise, I think he would really run the risk of, being ostracized.
Yeah. I think he if he did it, I think he'd wait till the 9th or 10th day just to show him.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, though. Like
circumcised on the 9th day of the tribe of Benjamin. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the thing. Like he might have no problem doing it. It's just that he wouldn't kind of foist that on someone else, right?
Well, and I think that he would be willing to do it for the sake of the gospel, and I think in that regard he'd almost need to if he wanted to continue to have a witness in Jewish communities. Although every time I read this, especially as a woman, this is just an odd conversation for me. Like, do people check, or
when you go into a Jewish nightclub back in the first century, you have to lift your loincloth real quick, just a spot check.
I guess when I was imagining as a child what I was going to do when I grew up, I did not think that I'd spend my time reading about circumcision quite as much as I do.
Funny story. I used to have a Messianic Jewish colleague who was a New Testament professor with us, and I had a bet with another colleague that I could slip in fake Yiddish words into conversation and he would never notice. And I got caught when I tried to slip in schmircumcise. So I was like Icarus. I was just too close to the sun.
Oh, man.
I had a student ask me last semester, though. He goes, Dr. Heim, so we were talking about Romans and circumcision in Romans, and he goes, so I'm a youth pastor. How would you teach this? How would you teach this to a youth group? And of course, I have no idea how you would teach this to a youth group. But what I said in the moment was, well, certainly not with a live demonstration.
I was going to say the opposite. I was going to say with a knife in hand.
I had a situation in class one time where I was talking about circumcision, and apparently, like this student told me later, she leaned over to someone next to her because she didn't know what circumcision was. And she said, does that mean that they could never have kids? And so that it was a miracle every time they had kids, because she thought it meant castrate. And then apparently the woman sitting next to her was like, no. And she started like sketching what circumcision was. and then the other woman was like, no, stop.
And then she pulled out some clay.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, that's amazing.
All right, let's go on to the next question. Although that would be a good ending point, but let's continue on quickly. Just wondered what your take is on the John MacArthur document, For the Sake of Christ and His Church, the Statement on Social Justice in the Gospel, that a reported 4,400 church leaders has signed in the U.S. Real quick, though, in terms of the symbolic significance, 4,400, Erin, can you speak to the numerical significance of that from a biblical New Testament perspective?
No, because I hate math.
Okay.
You're trying to get her to go
more than pretty much anything else.
Trying to get her to do some like Kabbalah Revelation stuff.
Matt, you've probably done a lot of math.
Yeah, I don't know. It could be connected to 144,000 in Revelation, quite clearly, or it's at least approximately near the number of the baptized that would respond. I think not at the Pentecost sermon, but after that, after we have the moment with the Sanhedrin in Acts. So it could be related to that. Has anyone read the document? I haven't read the document.
Yes, I've read the document.
You did read the document.
I didn't know what it was, and then I saw this question, and I asked some people in the office. I was like, what is this John MacArthur thing? And they all said unanimously, don't read it. It's just,
man,
it'll
that's
make you
prejudicing
mad.
you. So here, So Erin, you do want to make a case for it?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'll make a case against it.
Yeah. So
for reading it, be informed.
What's your take on it?
Do you know? I think it just comes across as incredibly, especially in the U.S., it comes across as tone deaf. And the fact that it's 4,400 people signing it, I think, is just an indication of just how tone deaf it is. At least at my institution, we have a kind of a long history of searching out the implications for the gospel in all spheres of life. Not to say that it has nothing to do with salvation. I mean, of course it has to do with salvation. Does it only have to do with the salvation of souls? No, I don't think we want to go back there in terms of our in our engagement. And I think that's that was the position of evangelicals before the rise of the evangelical right. And I think in terms of the backlash against, the quote unquote social justice warriors, you see that same kind of impulse to go back to our, holy huddle and say, well, what we really care about is saving souls. Well, it seems like if that's the case, I don't know what to do with a lot of the Gospels. It seems like Jesus
or the Torah,
right? But and if they're not reading the Old Testament, Drew. Come on. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, yeah, I don't see a lot of justification from Scripture, and from a group that is putting themselves forward as having such a high view of Scripture. I wonder where a lot of Scripture has gone, because it seems like if the purpose of proclaiming the gospel, if the gospel is a message about the reign and rule of King Jesus, it seems like that reign and rule touches on all aspects of life, not just on saving souls. So I don't think you can separate how we act in society, hopefully with justice and peace and holiness and all of those things, with what it means to be saved and part of the people of God. So, it just seems to me to be an artificial separation, and one that is reacting against things that I think I think are actually really important voices in the conversation. Like, how do Christians respond to racism? How do they respond to sexism? How do they respond to sexual abuse? All of those things are incredibly important issues for the church in North America to be grappling with. And this just seems to me to be, to put it bluntly, I think it's just, us wanting to put our heads in the sand, and that's profoundly unhelpful, I think.
Can I jump in here? So I've been still thinking and pondering the gospel a fair bit in the wake of my Salvation by Allegiance Alone book and continuing to write on it. And my next project that I've been working on is responding a little bit more directly to MacArthur, not to this document, but to some of his earlier work. And one of the assertions that MacArthur makes, it's a very common assertion, is that justification by faith is the heart of the gospel. And what's going on there is sort of a confusion over what the gospel is and sort of mixing that up and conflating it with gospel benefits. And so that what's ended up happening is you sort of treated something that's the gospel that's in fact something that's the benefit of the gospel and the means to the gospel. It sort of mixed them up. At least that's my assessment of what's going on there. And so there's sort of whenever you don't put Jesus' kingship in the center of the gospel and instead you put justification by faith there, well, then it becomes about saving souls, right? But if you begin to realize that justification is a benefit of the gospel, not the gospel, and that faith is not the gospel either, but the gospel is sort of the means of access to the gospel, or allegiances, or loyalty, or however we want to frame this. So what ends up happening, I think, is that the benefits of the gospel, some of them would be particularly unique to those who have allegiance to Jesus. We would want to talk about, the resurrection, unto a new life, co-reigning with Christ. That would be uniquely a benefit for those who have given allegiance to Jesus or responded in faith. But there are other benefits of the gospel that are general social benefits to all of society, that wouldn't be specially linked to making a saving confession, like assistance to the poor. And those are genuine gospel benefits as well. So we have to, I think, distinguish between the gospel proper and the gospel benefits. And we don't make those distinctions, we begin to get into trouble. And I think that's what's happening, I would guess, in MacArthur's document, just on the basis of his earlier work. But I should probably go read it.
That's right on. That well said, Matt.
Yeah, I sold 2 copies of your book right there.
Yeah. What'd you say?
You sold 2 copies of your book right there.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, I just looked at, I hadn't read the document either, and I looked at some blog posts on it that MacArthur wrote, and there were a number of things, I think, to echo Erin's phrase, that were completely tone deaf. And what a time to issue this document. It just seems like a real problem. I mean, a couple of the things in there, like he called social justice a newfound obsession among evangelicals, and I'm thinking, well, read your history there. And then that kind of isolating of the gospel from socioeconomic implications, and to me, one of the things I always say with my Old Testament students is that in the Old Testament, the paradigmatic salvation event is the Exodus, and that's an event of Israel being saved spiritually, economically, physically, politically. Those are all wrapped up in one another, and that hasn't just been sort of spiritualized and abstracted in the New Testament, and I think that's really important.
Is this the same John MacArthur who has it out for charismatics?
I would
maybe
guess so.
Didn't he have a conference that was just all about why charismatics says the charismatic movement is just a heresy or something
Strange
like that?
Fire.
Yeah. That's right. Okay.
Yeah, I have some vague memory of that dude from Acts 29 church going down and crashing that event sometime.
That's about the vagueness of my memory.
Trying to sell his books. It was really weird. It was very bizarre. But
okay.
All right. I digress. All right. I'm sure you have already recorded. Oh, sorry. So this is the
question about generational
Lindsay.
Curses, right? From Lindsay.
Yes. So any ideas on collective retribution and why it was changed? So actually, she asked first about. I was wondering in doing research about generational curses, and then any ideas on collective retribution and why it was changed. So I guess there are 2 issues there: generational curses and collective retribution.
I should also shout out to Lindsay. I don't know if it's Stepan or Stepan, but she is clearly a super fan. She's a huge supporter of ours. So Hello, Lindsay. I actually know something about the generational curses, or I have ideas about it. And the collective retribution, I'll cite a movie. But I have heard various takes on this. One of them is it's the third and the fourth generation. There's a guy doing his dissertation right now on the 3 and the 4 number patterns in Scripture. And when he started walking through them with me, I was like, oh, yeah, I had not put all those together. But one interpretation, I'm sure, Matt, you know others here, that if you think of the Beit of the house of the Father, is going to have 4 generations living in it. So when it says curses to the third and the fourth generation, it means everybody in your household basically is going to suffer from this, which that intuitively makes sense to me. I think there's more than that probably going on with some of the generational curses. I think also there's a great movie called Magnolia, which it's a horrible movie actually, but it's fantastically done. I mean, it's a tragic movie, I should say. But it's a very biblical movie by Paul Thomas Anderson. Is it Wes? No, it's Paul Thomas Anderson. And it's one of those movies that has 7 different storylines that all converge, and you all of a sudden realize they're all connected by one linchpin. And the linchpin ends up being these 2 fathers and the sins they committed, 30 years prior to the movie, the storyline in the movie. And what you're seeing in the movie is actually all the outflow to all their children and everybody they touched and affected. You're seeing all of those sins playing out in real time in the worst possible ways across all of these different people's lives. And so I think they even whisper the phrase "the sins of the father" at certain points in the movie, and then they have this whole Exodus 10 scene in there as well.
Wait, is that the movie that it rains frogs at the end?
Well, you just kind of ruined it for anybody who has not seen the movie yet.
I saw that when I was a lot younger.
Yeah.
Like I have no recollection of that movie except...
Yeah. It came out when I was in seminary, and I remember it just like, it was like a theologically sophisticated movie done by a guy
what
who
year
I think
was
is
that?
2002, 2001, somewhere around there.
Well, isn't there a distinction to be made between generational curses and generational cycles of sin, like you're describing?
Yeah, and I think the question is how much there's like first, or what they call primary causation and secondary causation, right? Is God actually going to punish your children for things you do, or
is
the
Magnolia
punishment
like the answer to John Steinbeck's East of Eden in some ways?
Yeah. There's another good one. We should have an East of Eden episode.
We should have an East of Eden episode. And everybody who is a seminary student should read that book.
Oh, absolutely. But it is one of those, when my students ask, when I point out that the meaning of names in the Hebrew Bible, especially in the Hebrew Bible and the Torah, and I say, and their name means this. And it's funny, the students, their instant response is, so that's not their real name. That's just, and I said, your presumption is that if a guy who was named Fool was acting foolish in the story, you presume that he would put that together himself, right? And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think we live out narratives that are already kind of set before us, and even when we can see them and where they're going, we still fall into them. And I think that's what East of Eden is showing, and Magnolia shows as well.
All right, let's real quick, maybe just one person. Hopefully you haven't done this, but it would be interesting to hear each of you talk about the pros and cons of different atonement theories as they relate to Christ. Do you prefer one theory or multiple theories? All right, that's a huge one.
I'm out on that. I have nothing to say about that.
Okay. So. Okay, I say multiple. Don't push one metaphor too far. That's the key, I think.
I would say the same, but I'm going to punt. Yeah,
I think Scott McKnight saying atonement theories are like golf clubs is a really helpful metaphor or simile.
Mm-hmm. So, like, you use different ones to do if you need to get.
They do different things.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you meant
like the 7-iron is the best one.
Oh.
That he didn't say that. I said that.
I prefer we should call these Kippur theories rather than atonement theories. I think there's kind of a heavy Anglo bias there.
I think the other thing, just real quick, is that I think in popular conversations, I often hear people conflate penal substitutionary atonement with substitutionary atonement, and just because you have a hang up with penal substitutionary atonement doesn't mean you need to also throw away the notion of substitution, which I think is hard, very, very hard to get get around from a biblical point of view. Okay, let's go on to the next one. I'm currently reading Paul and the Gift because of the podcast episode and many scholars on the podcast who point at it as an important book in Pauline studies. What makes it so important, and how could it shape future scholarship on Paul? Matt, or Drew, you've got something there?
I've actually got a copy of it.
You've got the book.
I just read it this summer. After so long of putting it off, and actually the same thing is I had so many people that said, I'd ask my Pauline friends, is it really a game changer? And they'd all go, yeah, it really is a game changer. I'll read two or three sentences here just to give you a flavor for what he's doing. This is on Galatians. As an unconditioned gift, the Christ events fits no performed evaluative schema, not even the schema of the Torah. It crosses conventional taxonomies at a diagonal, beholden to no pre-existent measurements of symbolic capital, but only its own given in Christ. Throughout Galatians, Paul indicates what this means at the practical, communal, and freedom of common meals shared by Jews and non-Jews, the creative operations of the Spirit. I mean, he actually says, prior to these sentences, he actually says that God's promises cannot be constrained by the Torah, right? Which on the whole, I think he's right. They're just hard words to chew. He's almost making Paul-like arguments where he's going really extreme so you can see the boundaries of the argument that he's making. But for me, as I read through it, I find it all clicked as to why this is such a big deal. Partly just because I didn't know the gift-giving culture issues, which help explain so much. I think it was one of those books that when you go and read the New Testament again, it really does change, every other passage you're reading for you.
Yeah, I can't say enough good things about this book. I do think it is the most important book that we'll see in quite some time. And what he's doing in the book is he's disentangling different ideas of grace that have tended to be bound together in people's minds. And this is going to be very disruptive to systematizations of salvation. Especially ones that have dominated the landscape of the conversation. You have Tulip on the one hand, you've got the Arminian positions on the other, and so on and so forth. And what he ends up doing, I think, is showing that things like the idea that we don't deserve grace, right? That's a separate issue from whether or not we need to reciprocate to grace. That's a different issue from whether or not grace is effective. That's a different issue from the size of the grace. And so as he begins to disentangle or pull apart these complex ideas about grace, we realize that there are traditional things that are packaged together in certain systems that don't need to be packaged that way and weren't packaged that way, neither in antiquity nor in the Bible. And that's the real significance of what he's doing. He's showing, for instance, that certain traditions have emphasized the priority of grace, the idea that God gave it before the foundations of the world in Christ, and have individuated that. And maybe that's not what Paul was doing, or if he was doing it, he might not have packaged that entirely with certain ideas about its effectiveness or certain ideas about its merit. So kind of pulling the strands apart and forcing us to look at them one at a time and to assess them independently, and then to try to put the system back together. That's, I think, where the real significance of the book is, and it's going to be extraordinarily disruptive, I think, to systematic theology.
Yeah, I totally agree with Matt. And I always tell my THM students read this in our Paul seminar. And one of the reasons we read it is because it's so important. The other reason we read it is because I think it is the model of what a good biblical scholar does. Because John Barclay is he's so patient with these texts and with these complex concepts that he's untangling. And he's so careful. And then he writes about it so clearly. I think for PhD students, for master students, it's the model of what good biblical studies can be and should be, I think.
I've also found the notion of perfection to be a really helpful intellectual concept to work with, not only on that topic of grace as he applies it there, but elsewhere. So this idea that you can look at intellectual trends in terms of taking something, a concept to its nth degree, to its nth logical degree, and drawing out all possible inferences in ways that might go beyond, what we see in the biblical text. So I mean, that was helpful for me thinking then about what Greg Boyd did with violence in the Old Testament and with the centrality of the cross in his whole program. And I've thought about it in different categories as well. So I found that part of his project to be transferable, which was another sign of its usefulness as a project.
I have one final question for us all, since we won't see each other until Denver 2018. Actually, I think we're all looking forward to San Diego 2019.
Denver is lovely in November, actually. It's pretty warm here.
I'm happy with Denver. It beats. Well, I won't even name other cities, but we don't want their mayors calling OnScript and giving us hassle. So, but I do wonder what you guys are looking forward to at SBL AAR. Like, what's the thing on the horizon that you think is going to be the funnest to attend, or sometimes it's just perusing the bookstalls for me.
I have not even looked at the program book, so I don't know what's on.
I always just look forward to seeing friends, honestly, and I find it I half the time hardly get to sessions, to be honest, as I'm busy catching up with people. So yeah, I'm sort of a bad SBL person in that way. I love it, but I'm a bad
it's this
attender.
thing where I love going, but then having to sign so many books and have people like come up to me and be like, "Oh, I loved what you wrote," and it gets tiring, having fans around and that kind of thing. I'm not trying to brag. It's just that's the reality of my experience there is that constant fandom,
That was last year in Boston when you when you stole Marcus Bachmuel's name tag.
Well, that's part of it, but
Yeah.
Okay, well, I looked at it a while ago because I had to figure out when I was giving a paper, because I'm also supposed to be teaching a class at the same time. They got scheduled at the same time, so now I have to cancel my class. And I don't think I can tell my students to come to SBL or.
Oh,
anyway.
they can get in. That's no problem.
Yeah, I think they just don't want to.
Yeah, I sneak in every year. I haven't paid for like 10 years.
You're just in it for the free coffee in the bookstall, aren't you?
I can't even spell SBL.
No, I'm looking forward to Richard Hayes' lecture at IBR. I'm really looking forward to that.
Is it the plenary session?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Oh, that'll be good.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And then for my new position that I'm taking up in January, I've had to learn lots about the Synoptic Gospels that I didn't know before. So Richard Burridge has a 25th anniversary of his What Are the Gospels that's coming out, and I believe it has a panel review session at SBL. That's the word on Facebook anyway. So I haven't looked into it, but if that's true, I'm going to it because I need to know things.
If you need help with gospel stuff, you can just
totally.
call me. I can help
it's
you
all
with
about
the secondary literature,
Torah,
so.
right?
It's pretty much the same as JEDP.
Right.
Just if you just keep that in mind, you're fine.
Okay. Yeah, I think it'll be.
I do have a chapter in my dissertation on Mark's gospel.
So you know things about Mark?
I'm hip.
Are they just philosophical things?
Oh, I
or
know
are they,
things.
It's like more wide-reaching than that.
There's so much hate behind your eyes.
There's no hate. It's
that trombonist in you coming out.
Trombonist.
It's so much worse than the trombone section.
Same thing.
They're a lot more.
Oh, sorry. Wah, wah,
is that your trombone impression?
No, actually, that was my tuba impression. Of that.
Hey, that's my territory.
You play the tuba? Oh, that's awesome. We should have like an.
Holy crap!
Yeah,
I play drums.
Yeah,
we could do a polka band.
I had a 4-valve rotary valve Cervini Piggy. That was the type of tuba I played. Yeah, actually, I still own it, but it's in my sister's using it because she's a music teacher in Florida.
So hey, Matt Bates.
Yeah,
can you sing like for all the girls I've loved before? Or something?
I can play spoons actually really well. Yeah.
Oh.
All right, folks, that's been our OnScript Q&A episode. Thanks so much for listening in, and tune back in for our next episode. It's going to be even better.
Tuning in is a metaphor because nobody tunes anything anymore with digital.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.